Hello? If everyone could take their seats, we're going to get started. Okay, if everyone could take their seats. As I mentioned, we are going to get started now, so if everyone could also stop their side conversations. Before we jump into our afternoon sessions, we appreciate everyone's attention. We know this is a lot of sitting in a room, but on the other hand, the presentations, people have worked really hard on them, and they're really amazing, so we appreciate your continued attention. Before we get started, we are really excited to have Henk Ovink here, who has been a really inspirational person in creating this project, and so he's here just to say a few words to help us get excited for the next round of this challenge.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. It's amazing. I was asked not to do slides because then you're stuck with me for the rest of the day. But I can do that without slides. Just a couple of notions, not to take away your attention for the teams, because it's all about the teams today and the amazing work they've done thus far. Also, the supporting team of Resilient by Design, I think. Yeah. You all did a fantastic job, 50 places in the last weeks, seeing everyone and everything. And I think that's a really important part. I flew in this morning. I actually have a weird relationship with climate change. I make it worse. I'm in 3 continents every month, and I don't do this in a boat with a sail, but with a plane. But I assure you, I buy every time a forest or some trees. I think it's a forest every month. So I flew in from Buenos Aires, but I actually came from Bonn, the climate conference. I want to talk to you a little about the importance of the work you're doing. Because we were chatting over lunch and somebody said, you know, it's like a sea level rise camp, party, festival. And I think that's very good. You've been crisscrossing this region and you're falling in love. This is what it is. You're getting attached to the place, the challenges and the people. And there's a reason why. And I get my list. And you can, you know, there's lists every day. But just of today and yesterday, in Greece, deadly floods. In Sri Lanka, 1,700 displaced. 9 dead in Indonesia. Colombia, more death and despair. Kenya, Vietnam, Malaysia. India, Thailand, Germany, Poland, Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala. This is just the last 2 weeks. So when Harvey hit Houston, people were complaining that the 1,200 or more casualties in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh were not top of the news, which was in the same week. But my Bangladeshi colleagues I was with at that time said, we mourn with the United States for the death and despair, but for us it's important that that is in the news too. Climate change is not a developing world country's issue. This is what you are working on. And the importance of that you should not underestimate, because we're in the amazing opportunity to come up with the best ideas, real solutions for real people in real communities that are really suffering socially, economically, and by climate change, that can really make this place better and inspire the world. Don't forget this. Your mission, your Sea Level Rise party, is watched now online, or after I've talked online again with the teams, is watched. And whatever you will come up will be an inspiration for so many people that do not have the capacity, do not have the resources, and do not have the networks as you guys have. So that's one message I wanted to give you. And the other is, and I'm on the jury, so I can't talk to what the team said, so all amazing. We will get to jury comments in a later time. But I do think 3 years ago was my lecture at Spur in July. At the board meeting, board dinner that night, and we were in the middle of Rebuild by Design, the thing in New York you heard about, I guess. And then they asked me, they said, "Hey, Henk, you were lucky, in New York. You had Sandy." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, got attention, $60 billion of damage, all these houses lost, federal, state, local." I said, so you're telling me that California needs a disaster to become smart and do a thing like any normal person would do, is look at the future and say, "Oh, that's complex. Let's work on that." And they said, "Yes." I said, "No, you can do this." 3 years later, here you are. So everyone can do this. And I'm proud to tell you that last week in Bonn, I launched an initiative I started in Asia, the place that's going to be hit hardest, or is hit hardest by climate change these days, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's called Water as Leverage. You can look it up on the internet, waterasleverage.org. I'm a water envoy, so I talk about water the whole time. And it's focusing at the same thing Rebuild by Design was focusing on, and Resilient by Design is too. And it is getting this talent, this amazing group of people from all over the world, including local, together to rethink the future. And you would, when I wake up in the morning, I think this is like normal. This is what we should do, but it's not. This is exceptional. We should make this the next new normal. I mean, climate change is the new normal, but you should be the new normal. Your way of working, investing upfront to really understand vulnerabilities, interdependencies, opportunities, work with people, and you know the term low-hanging fruit? Yeah? You do? Who uses this? Do you just be honest? I mean, we're among friends, the door is closed. Just raise your hand. Who uses low-hanging fruit? Yeah, I hate it. You know why? You are not here for low-hanging fruit. You are here for high-hanging fruit. You are here to inspire, but also to make a difference. You can't escape. The door's, well, ajar, but forget it. Yeah, I'll close it myself. You can't escape. I want you for the best projects, the ones that really, really make a difference, the ones that bridge the gap between our current policies, our current ways of interaction, our current politics, our total disconnect with the future of climate change and the way we're dealing with it. You can do this. You can bridge this gap, but not with low-hanging fruit. So, go. I love you too, really. I'm amazed by the work thus far. I'll be more amazed end of the day. I'll be with you, the whole competition, but also after. And I think perhaps that's the last word. This won't stop. Don't worry. We'll make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. Now, without further ado, we're going to jump into our first presentation of the afternoon, Public Sediment.
Great. So, it's difficult to see. So I'm Gina Worth. I'm from Scape Landscape Architecture and the Dredge Research Collaborative, and I am incredibly excited to be here today to talk about mud and show the work of a collaborative and incredible team, including Dredge Research Collaborative. Brett Milligan is here in the back representing that group, Arcadis, TS Studio, Buoyant Ecologies Lab, and UC Davis. We're incredibly excited to share kind of our research. Our team really believes that the Baylands is living infrastructure. This mosaic of ecosystems, the marshes and mudflats that shape this region, are the infrastructure of the future that we should be investing in today. The Baylands are incredible. They host our food sources. They treat our waste. They are these vast, almost incomprehensible places in terms of their scale, yet they hold these bundles of critical infrastructure at their shore: the ports, the dredge channels, the train lines, the highways. They also host species, threatened and endangered species, at different points in their life cycle. And while they appear passive, while they seem like these large passive expanses of green and brown and blue, they protect us and buffer and cushion the impacts of sea level rise and flooding. Yet these Baylands, these resources, face slow and invisible risk. Henk is right. There is no immediate disaster that this region has encountered. The disaster is slow and will happen over time, but it will be disastrous if we do not act now. This is an urgent problem. This is an urgent problem for people in terms of the number of people, critical infrastructure, including drinking water, transportation networks, energy networks that are at the Bayland interface, but it's also an issue for these ecosystems themselves. And this quote has been really inspirational for our work from the Baylands Climate Change Report, that most of the marshes are projected to be damaged or destroyed by 2100 unless we intervene now. So while there is no major disaster, this is the major disaster, and the Baylands are the infrastructure that our team proposes that we invest in today. This risk is joint ecological and human, and we have focused on these issues in our definition of this question. We've looked at this mosaic of ecosystems that really spans from the subtidal environs to mudflats to marshes, kind of within this tidal range, the diked ponds, and then the vulnerable communities that exist at the edge. The exciting thing about Baylands, the tidal Baylands, is that they have the ability to grow along with the threat of climate change if that happens at a slower rate. If we are faced with higher levels of sea level rise than we anticipate, and we have low sediment in the system, these ecosystems, these Baylands, will change over time. Mudflats will expand, marshes will shrink, and with higher rates of sea level rise, like 7 feet by 2100, these ecosystems will drown, and vulnerable shoreline communities will be highly impacted. We will have deeper water at the shoreline, which will be damaging for populations along the edge and damaging for infrastructure along the edge, as well as large-scale ecological change. And so our team feels that what's at the core of this question, it's mud. It's this mucky substance at the bottom of the bay is really kind of core to this future ecological trajectory that we are already advancing along. We believe that sediment is the building block of resilience in the bay. And many scientists have begun to look at these questions, and there's many reports kind of beginning to show how this ecosystem, the bayland, the tidal bayland ecosystem, will transform over time if we are faced with high levels of sea level rise and low levels of sediment like we have today. We know that sediment builds baylands. This is kind of an abstract concept to begin to think about. We have really modified how sediment flows through our systems. We've modified this really differently over time. So historically, sediment flowed downstream from tributaries local to the bay and from the large-scale rivers of the Sacramento and San Joaquin River. And so these systems, these conduits of sediment, brought sediment to the bay and built the marshes that we know. However, we've really intervened in these systems. In the era of the gold rush, we power washed the hillsides through hydraulic mining and actually increased the sediment loads that came down to the bay and actually built more marsh with this pulse of sediment that moved through. But this pulse is over, and now we face a totally different condition, which is that we have sediment trapped upstream. We have invested in a huge way in infrastructure that stops the flow of sediment. So we have dams, we have flood control channels, and this means that sediment is not making it to the bay, and that bayland interface is not able to keep up with the pace of climate change. So how much sediment is needed? This is like a really difficult question. Our team struggled for weeks around this question of trying to figure out what is going on. And while we did a lot of calculations and charts, we ultimately just decided to use the best science that was available out there, which is the work of the San Francisco Estuary Institute. This is some of the work that's being shown at the Estuary Conference a couple weeks ago. And it shows this chart of how much sediment might be needed just to sustain the existing tidal baylands that we have today with 3.5 feet of sea level rise and a low sediment supply. So what's shown on the right is what's coming in from local tributaries and the delta, and what's shown on the left is how much might be needed over time. And this is a really variable number. Though this is informed by science, there's a huge number of uncertainties that we have to factor in. We might have a higher sediment supply in the future if we have catastrophic fires and erosion, but we also might have much greater needs for sediment if the sea levels rise faster than anticipated. And if we restore more tidal wetlands, these are more spaces that will need sediment in the future. So all of this work is like very complicated and very interesting, but the big conclusion is that there is not enough mud to sustain the ecosystems that we know. So what are other sources? How can we think more creatively about this material? How can we think about tributaries, realign them to actually move more sediment downstream? Break up dams, harvest dams, think about using the sediment source in a different way. How can we think about repurposing dredge material? Right now, 30% of all dredge material leaves the bay. It's treated as a waste product, and it is dumped offshore. And this is not due to a lack of care or a lack of intelligence around the system. We need to collaborate to make sure this doesn't happen and find new funding mechanisms, new regulatory mechanisms, and new physical design techniques to keep the mud in the bay. We also need to consider new sources, totally unconventional sources like biosolids, tunnel fill, levee deconstruction. But even with all of these sources, is this enough mud? That was a question for us. So we began to look at that. And these maps, again, the need is shown in the bright yellow, and the sources are shown in brown. So even if there was this huge effort to marshal all of these different sources and apply them in the bay and have this like giant mud management strategy to move stuff around, we still have a really big discrepancy between what the tidal baylands are projected to need today and what is available in the future. And this discrepancy just grows if we have higher rates of sea level rise. So our team has come to the conclusion that the baylands will change, and they potentially will change dramatically, and we have to position ourselves now to truly address this. And so what does the future look like? We are projecting a large-scale transition from marsh to mudflat to open water. This is terrifying if you're an ecologist, I think, especially if you study coastal, wetland, and estuarine systems, because it would mean a complete transformation of this ecological fabric. But I think it also should be terrifying if you are a resident of the Bay Area, because this means we will have deeper water closer to our front doors. We will have a much more vulnerable system if our bayland infrastructure drowns over time. This has different spatial impacts in different parts of the bay. In the North Bay, this mosaic, this transformation from marsh to mudflat to open water, has dramatic impacts on the communities that are at the tips of the tributaries. So you can kind of see in the red on these slides the impacted communities. But in the South Bay, we have massively developed in the floodplain, so it has an even more transformative impact. This bayland cushion, this amazing kind of mosaic of ecosystems that helps buffer the tidal range, is sinking, is drowning over time. And this network, this kind of swath or this band of urban areas will become much more vulnerable and exposed. So we think this is problematic. It's ecologically problematic. It's problematic for people. And we are proposing to really investigate and invest in the baylands ecosystems. And I think what's exciting about working in the Bay Area is that we think you have the capacity to do this. There is this legacy of Bay activism and kind of organizing around these ecological resources that's hugely inspiring to us coming from New York City. We see a lot more of it here, so that's a really exciting environment to be in. It has this legacy of organizing against bay filling at this very large scale. And this map on the left became a template for change and organizing and the creation of Save the Bay over time. And we see the map on the right as kind of equally critical right now to organize around this slow and invisible risk of a deeper, harder bay with more vulnerable communities at its edges and more vulnerable ecosystems. So, what should we do? These are really big problems. And so we do not propose any singular silver bullet solution. There is no silver bullet solution to this threat. We have a low sediment supply likely in the future. We know that sea level rise is exacerbating. And our team is attempting to bend this curve. We are attempting to change this trajectory through the strategies that we call public sediment. So these strategies, this is a constellation of approaches. This is not a singular piece of infrastructure or a singular move. This is a suite of strategies that are physical, about designing with mud, but they are also social. This is about making sediment public and making this resource valued, known, and recognized as part of our resilient infrastructure and part of the systems that we invest in the future. And so we think it's incredibly critical to apply public sediment strategies across this longitudinal cross-section, from upland to lowland, to the interface to the bay edges. We propose to design with mud across this suite of places, and we propose to make sediment public within communities and connect them to the bay, connect them to this critical resource. This is public sediment. And so as we begin to kind of walk through these spaces, we begin to see what we are talking about when we're talking about designing it with mud. We're talking about harvesting dams. We're talking about redesigning channels to move sediment through them. We're talking about creating pools and places for sediment to gather. We're also talking about connecting communities along and across these resources to tributaries and to the bay through a series of mudrooms and sensing stations that really make this very intangible topic visceral and real. We also are hoping to open and unlock the flows of these creeks and allow them to enter the baylands themselves and have new strategies, to experiment with new strategies for designing and placing mud and other sources of sediment, like dredge material, in the bay in more passive ways that allow the sediment to move around with the currents. And so this project and proposal is translated now into 3 design opportunities. And these design opportunities operate across 3 scales. We have a regional scale of project, a South Bay scale of project, and a tributary scale of project. But this is not a master plan, and it's not 3 projects that are kind of independent. These projects are, I think, activist in the way they're trying to suggest we have to think totally differently about these systemic resources. We have to change the system, we have to value ecosystems differently, we have to value them as infrastructure, and we have to test these strategies in the most meaningful way possible. And so these are our 3 projects. The first we call Pilots for a Future Bay. And so this is our regional proposal, but really it's our smallest scale proposal because we have identified a series of small scale pilot projects that we think can change the system. These pilot projects are both physical and regulatory in nature. So we think that these questions really require collaboration and discussion between our regulatory partners and our kind of physical design partners. So we propose underwater mud berms, we propose biosolids as a substrate for wetland building, we propose dam releases, specifically at Searsville Dam as the kind of pilot case study, and we propose building new habitat for risk reduction purposes and kind of challenging these questions around habitat conversion because we know habitats will convert in the future. So again, these are strategies and proposals that are pilot in nature. We would like to test them, but we would also like designers to engage in the regulatory conversations and the policy conversations that frame this work. This is our bay, our mud, and all of these resources must stay in the bay, and we think this series of pilots could really help advance that question. We also think while they can scale up and influence the region, they will be most influential if we work with students today to begin to develop them. So as part of this project, we propose to work with middle and high school students to design the pilots, as they are ecosystem stewards of the future and will need to scale up public sediment strategies. Our second project is called the Bay Cushion. We love this word cushion because it's very descriptive of that dissipating, buffering impact that the baylands have. We need to value ecosystems as protective infrastructure, not just as infrastructure for the salt marsh harvest mouse or the clapper rail, but as infrastructure for people. The South Bay Salt Ponds is this incredible project that we were just amazed with when we went to go see this work about the kind of opening up of these big salt ponds to tidal exchange, growing and restoring marshes and mudflats of the future. But it is not currently valued or invested in as a piece of risk reduction infrastructure. And so scientists also are beginning to look at this work. Mark Stacy did a modeling analysis of the South Bay salt ponds, and he did a version where the South Bay salt ponds had hard edges, and he found that this actually amplified the tidal extremes throughout the entire bay with a sea level rise of, I think, about a meter, and that he also found that a scenario where he studied opening up these tidal ponds to tidal exchange, and that shallow water at the edge of the bay dissipated tidal force around the entire bay. So this is the South Bay is a kind of very particular local condition that has bay scale impact. That's incredibly interesting and incredibly valuable, and we're very excited about that potential, and we think that we should be investing in this project, in this restoration project, as a piece of risk reduction infrastructure. But we also know the South Bay, just like all other edges of the bay, while it accretes more rapidly, also faces the same challenge of low sediment supply and sea level rise. And so in this project, we propose to look at this and say, what can we do to prevent this trajectory? Because this is not just bad for habitat, this is bad for people living at the edges. What is the future of the bay cushion? How do we preserve the function of this bay cushion over time? And how do we do it with low sediment alternatives? How do we invest differently? How do we invest with money differently? But also, how do we invest with sediment differently in this project? And so these are just some speculative proposals, but if we work on this project, we would like to model and study these different alternatives. An outer ring of marshes, a double ring of mudflats and marshes, and a large-scale kind of migration alternative, looking at these potential futures, what risk reduction benefits they have, how they might be sustainable from a sediment supply standpoint, and how might they impact future habitat of the South Bay. And so while this is a layer onto the adaptive management project that's already underway, we also think it's incredibly important to engage people in this question. While the South Bay Salt Pond is really viewed as a recreational resource, we know it is a cushion to the neighborhoods adjacent to the bay, and that we must begin to engage people in these questions, to bring them closer to these systems, to understand and monitor and provide community tools for organizing around the impacts of climate change. A series of sensors kind of spread throughout these neighborhoods like Alviso, which are right at the edge and already facing the impacts of groundwater and sea level rise today, but also creating spaces for more visceral interaction, mud rooms within the bay where people can go engage with this resource. And so this is a large-scale ecological modeling proposal, but it is also a very fine-grained community capacity building and organizing tool for the South Bay. Our third proposal, our last proposal, is called Unlock Alameda Creek. And I think our whole team is super psyched about this project. We want to work in a big trib. We think tributaries are kind of key to this question. Alameda is the largest largest local tributary that feeds the bay. And we really feel like this is the most meaningful place that we could apply public sediment of the future today. So tributaries are connective. They truly connect sediment to the baylands, which I think everyone understands now. But they connect fish, right? So there's these species of fish that require the tributaries to gain access to their upstream spawning ground. They also connect people. They can divide neighborhoods, but they also can connect people to one another and to the bay. But these tributaries have been designed almost exclusively for flood control. They've been sterilized, they've been channelized, they've been contained. And we think that we need to think differently about these tributaries. We must still protect for flooding. It's incredibly important that we don't expose any of these communities to future flood risk, but we must think about redesigning these tributaries to be much more ecologically and socially productive spaces. So we propose to apply our suite of public sediment strategies to this tributary, to harvest the uplands, to unlock the channel, to place mud in the bay in a different way, but also connect people to this story, to apply this network of tributary paths, of mud rooms, of sensing stations, to connect along this and create a kind of critical fabric of infrastructure, of social infrastructure that leads to the bay. And then finally, to design with a sediment-sensitive species. Our team, admittedly, is obsessed with mud, and so we have chosen to look at steelhead, which is actually quite sensitive to sediment in the water, and steelhead use this route to spawn today, and we'd like to design to make sure that we are preserving that route and not doing anything to damage that critical habitat in the future. Actually, we're trying to enhance that critical habitat in the future. So we think this is possible to do today here in Alameda Creek to really unlock its physical, social, and sediment potential. And again, it's an incredibly scalar project and suite of ideas, but we think they will combine here in Alameda Creek in the form of dam harvesting, in the form of channel design, in the form of sensing stations, in the form of levee breaching, and also to kind of truly create a space that connects its communities with the bay, with these larger stories about how mud actually creates this bayland, these protective cushions for the region, and will scale up over time. So we're incredibly excited about this project, Alameda Creek project and process, but also excited because we think it's replicable. It's highly replicable to all the other tributaries that feed the bay and help promote living infrastructure of the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're just going to move right into our next team. So Team Uplift, you want to come up?
Okay, hello everyone. We're really excited to be able to present to you some of the synthesis that's come out of the research effort and to present some of the design opportunities. I'm Ricky from Gensler, we're Team Uplift, and with me I have Jack from Arab, Cecil from Margie Ruddock Landscape, John from Stamen UCLA, and Amitav from HRNA. And you see here, these are the kind of skill sets that we actually bring in terms of how we need to kind of deal with resilience and solve that. So, you know, when we started conversing with some of the kind of experts and the community, I think we realized that there was this common thing that the communities were being squeezed between the surging tides and the kind of surging kind of housing issues and economic factors. And so we're really working within the interface of that. The one question that we asked ourselves, and we were really interested when we were doing our analytical kind of research phase, is really about finding that, that one place where we can apply this kind of acupunctural intervention that really has a positive impact kind of regionally in the Bay Area. So it was really about understanding it sort of economically, ecologically, and socially, but it was really about making sure that there was, the move that we actually do had local benefit, but also impacted things regionally as well. So these are our four kind of strategic goals, and you know, we talk about how we need to develop a kind of a local solution, and we also need to make sure that it's kind of an equitable solution. So it's not us just coming up with a solution, but working with the community to do that. And then from there, figuring out how do we focus in on a solution that begins to think about environmental innovation and economic displacement, but also the solution needs to be really robust in many ways and needs to be scalable. So when we talk about this, right, so what does it really mean to design a lasting future for the Bay Area? You know, we already know there's $130 billion of value of structures in the floodplain. Again, so how do we protect for that? If we think about, like, there's 30% growth happening in between 2010 and 2040 in the Bay Area. So how do we think about the growth aspect? When we think about Trans-Bay corridors, and even the study that's been done right now suggests that there's 152% capacity in 2040. So how do we think about moving goods and people? And then there's really only 20% of the Bay shoreline that's accessible. So how do we kind of engage that? Each of these systems actually don't run independently. And when we think about resilience, we got to make sure that we think about all these four things together.
So given the complexity and the gravity of this challenge, our team approached the research phase eager to listen and to learn from the regional experts, from the resilience experts, and the community leaders to find out really what they had to teach us about resilience. So looking back at the last 10 weeks or so of our process, it wasn't surprising to realize that really our most vital insights came from walking through neighborhoods and through talking with community leaders and really being led by those who have dedicated their lives and their careers to protecting communities in the Bay Area. So besides our external outreach effort, our team actually leaned heavily as well on our subject matter experts to conduct qualitative and quantitative research and also to synthesize a wealth of information into our design workshops that we conducted internally as a team. Together, it was our external outreach and our internal workshops that really gave us the insights that we built on over the design concepts that Ricky and Cecil will be talking about in a few minutes. So taking a step back for a second, our team was also very eager to identify sites early on so that we could actually talk with members of the community and trade ideas before developing fully formed concepts. So we started with over 50 sites and what felt like limitless problems and opportunities to work through. And from these 50 sites, we really narrowed it down to 10 particular sites. And from those, we really found that 2 in particular, we looked north, south, east, and west, but we found that West Oakland and East Palo Alto were the 2 sites that really presented the greatest opportunities for our team to build resilience and to achieve our goals within the strategy that we outlined. So in terms of the approach that we took to screening the different sites and through our site selection process, we didn't want to approach this in an arbitrary way and simply select sites based on gut feel or intuition. We wanted to take a more data-driven approach that was really informed by science. So we began that by outlining these 6 key stressor categories, which we found to be the most prevalent in the Bay Area and also the most relevant to resilience. So with these 6 key factors outlined, we were able then to subdivide those into very specific research areas. So for example, within seismic risk, we looked at liquefaction potential around the bay and identified sites that were really most vulnerable to that hazard. Within equity, for example, we looked at the spatial distribution of gentrification and displacement risks, and we looked at those throughout all of the sites within the bay. And down the list we went until we had data that really informed our selection process and allowed us to compare sites side by side. So with these 6 key stressor categories identified and looking at these across our 4 strategic goals, our team developed a screening matrix that had over 50 factors and over 51 sites. And really this matrix provided a tool to our team to allow us to evaluate sites in really a more objective way. And looking at all of the sites and looking at all of the factors that we took into account, from flooding to housing to mobility to ecology, again, we came back to 2 sites in particular, West Oakland and East Palo Alto, that really spoke to our team and really, we thought, presented the greatest opportunities for us to have high-level regional impacts from very localized interventions. And from this research, we were also able to tentatively identify our intervention area and begin designing the concepts that Ricky and Cecil will be walking through.
So the first item we're going to be talking about is the Oakland Gateway area. And what's really interesting about this area, again, is it's very rich in many ways, and all this infrastructure, it's a real 3-dimensional equation and solution where there's so many different factors that come together. One of the most important things about it is that Oakland already has this kind of vibrant character, its color, its richness to it. So making sure that we actually understand what that is and work with that as a basic framework is really important. But again, with that, how do we create kind of new experiences on top of that, and how do we connect these experiences together, and how do we work with the community to really figure that out? So when we're balancing opportunities here, it's really about thinking about environmental justice, gentrification, and displacement in many cases. But can we actually build something actually adjacent to for example, like West Oakland, to increase opportunity, but also create something that actually benefits the community adjacent to it as well? And is there a way to manage displacement with that? And then is there a way of really thinking about how do we, the risk of sea level rise and flooding in so many different ways and different typologies? So in terms of the constraints, again, sea level rise, we need to figure out what we do. There's actually 2 vulnerabilities in that area. What do we do with the East Bay mud and the water waste treatment plant? And how do we think about some of the investments that are actually in the liquefaction zones? We're thinking about growing the community because of growth. It's like, if we think about displacement, affordability of housing, gentrification, what do we do with that? Are there ways of preparing for this 30% rise in jobs and housing needs? In terms of moving, again, infrastructure is a huge thing. Infrastructure actually could connect, but in many cases it does divide. So how do you actually create infrastructure that begins to provide value for its adjacencies? Again, with kind of mobility and infrastructure, are there ways of thinking about it from a health and wellness perspective? And if we want to engage, how do you actually get a community to connect back to the bay? We have an operating port. There's all this rail infrastructure, but how are the ways that we do that? And then sometimes, in many cases, here with Oakland and Alameda, the estuary kind of divides up those communities. So how can we connect those things together? So the first design opportunity and concept that we talk about is bridging communities through uplift. So the first thing we do is protect the edges, Gateway Park, also down on the southern side where the estuary is. In terms of growing, there's opportunities of creating and utilizing the underutilized rail areas and to be able to create a deck and a community above that. There's also opportunities to kind of ease some of that growth pressure as well. In terms of moving, can we actually rethink the I-880 corridor and see what we can actually do with that? Can we also reorganize some of the port logistics? Remember all the pollution, the air pollution, all of those things are coming from there, but how do we actually mitigate some of that so there's some advantages for the community? And then is there a way to create this kind of eco-connection between Alameda and Oakland? And in terms of engaging, again, if we create this new deck above the railway, is there a way of creating this kind of new connection, bringing green and water closer to West Oakland, but also being able to get closer to the water from West Oakland as well? And then is there a way of creating that connection to Oakland? So the strategies here are kind of a synthesis in terms of our concepts of what we're thinking of doing. It's really, again, thinking about how do we intertwine the kind of ecological and urban conditions, so it's not isolated, but how do we use that to our advantage? And we do that in order to be able to protect, grow, engage, and move people. So this is thinking about things three-dimensionally. You see the existing is at the top, and then you see a section at the bottom. The section shows how you can actually have a dialogue between West Oakland and this new community in terms of what we do with kind of new opportunities for managed development. And you can see that the rail logistics and the rail is below. You also have new opportunities for habitat and job growth and new parks as well. This is just another variation of that. And again, there's no single solution to this, right? So we need to work with the community to figure out what those things are going to be. And again, some of the stuff is driven obviously by policy and regulatory aspects, but thinking about those economic aspects as well will begin to kind of change this around. And this is a conceptual image of what we want to say. We want to really connect some of these communities to the bay, but really thinking about the operational aspects. The port needs to operate, but through clever ways of using design and working with the community, we'll be able to connect some of these connections that allow for these new opportunities that are given in that text. So new jobs, new housing, farmers market, opportunities for sports, constructed wetlands, really talks to about the culture and diversity of this new place.
We found the challenges and opportunities in this area so compelling and complex that we developed another concept for it. Using some of the moves that we have shown in our previous concept, but really shifting our focus towards bringing water in and using it to connect communities from Gateway Park to Alameda. Our concept reimagines the regional infrastructure, which has disproportionately negatively impacted West Oakland, and in particular the wastewater treatment plant, which will become increasingly vulnerable with sea level rise, more severe rain events, and increasing populations. While the sea level rise protection will happen primarily along the shoreline with both hard and soft protective infrastructure, we saw an opportunity to use the 880 right-of-way to address some of the current and impending issues by transforming the spaces under and adjacent to the highway with a green, spongy corridor. We can treat wastewater with wetlands, provide habitat and open space, provide a green buffer for highway air pollution, provide land that acts as a sponge during flooding events, and create a new and protected bay trail. The corridor would link Gateway Park through West Oakland and down to Alameda, where we're proposing a new bridge to connect West Alameda to Oakland, providing a critical missing link. The right-of-way actually closely aligns with the historic shoreline, and by transforming this land, we're reconnecting two parts of the bay that were historically tied together. In an area so cut off from the bay, we think it's critical to provide more ways and spaces of engaging with the bay and to use water as cultural placemaking, understanding that resiliency is not just about flood protection, but also about creating social cohesion. This likens to cities with canal networks. The canals were often built to control for flooding, but over time have become iconic elements of the city, and we see that by creating a sense of place and strengthening community. At the southern end of our site, the Oakland estuary currently forms a barrier between Oakland and Alameda. By bridging the estuary, we can connect communities, activate both sides of the estuary, as well as provide more access to the water and evacuation route during disasters. By reconfiguring the existing transportation arteries, including undergrounding the rail, we can create space for development, improve the air quality, and reduce neighborhood traffic. Further north towards the Bay Bridge, the existing conditions show the breadth of land devoted to the rail and 880 corridor. Our concept transforms this land into a blue-green corridor, and while we likely won't be able to absorb all 63 million gallons of water currently treated by the wastewater plant daily, a series of constructed wetlands within the corridor could treat some of that wastewater, allowing for infiltration and improved water quality discharge to the bay. We also see that those wetlands could act as habitat, providing a missing link between the Emeryville Crescent Marsh and down to the Oakland Estuary and San Leandro Marsh. Adjacent uses could include recreation areas and other floodable programs so that during storm events, there's more land to absorb water. The anchor of our blue-green corridor is the bridge to Alameda, which will integrate mixed-use development so that people can work where they live, enhance the park system and transportation network through dedicated bus lanes and bike lanes and open space, reduce traffic and commute times by providing more direct route to the East Bay, and most importantly, connect two communities, creating a stronger, more resilient Oakland and Alameda.
So the third site that we're going to be talking about is East Palo Alto and the Barton Bridge crossing area. And I just want to preface this just right now is that basically that there's really some complicated regulatory aspects down there. In terms of growth, I think, we need to think about how we can think about evolution of cities in the future. And so we're looking more for long-term as kind of like the 2050 aspects. Again, East Palo Alto, I think amazing character, the richness, so how do we keep that as a foundation? How do we introduce some of these new experiences? But again, here, it's about how do you actually create this, how do you build on the bay and kind of still maintain some of that ecological aspect? So how do you do an intervention that may not have much impact actually on the bay, but will improve other aspects? Again, we need to protect some of the edges. Thinking about growth, those three communities there, we talked about East Palo Alto, and Menlo Park. Think about affordability. Again, how do we move the Dumbarton Bridge itself and the damage or the rail corridor? How do we begin to connect those things together? And how do we think about engaging with the water and so that the water actually becomes a destination as well? So the third one we call habitat opportunities above and below. So again, we'll protecting the edges of EPA from sea level rise and flooding with a new typology. Is there a way to improve jobs and housing by thinking about the opportunity actually by the water, thinking about transportation in terms of new ferry connections, again, thinking about a multifaceted bridge system that begins to tie together all these types of different modes of transportation. And then how do we engage, and it's really this opportunity zone, is there a way of creating this habitable intervention on the bay? So these are some of the strategies that we're thinking about need to all come together in terms of being able to move, protect, engage, and grow this area. So here's a section basically showing that kind of intervention that is actually on the bay. We're thinking about this thing as you know, how do you get back to some of the natural kind of tidal flows, but is there something that we can actually create that can really think about managed displacement and other opportunities for habitat and housing? So we call this one, you know, again, this conceptual image, really it's the bay as home and its destination, as opposed to the bay just being a thoroughfare.
As you heard earlier from Ricky, that the economic lens played a very important role, not just in identifying the sites and identifying the interventions in terms of where they will go, choosing the areas where they'll have the greatest impact, and communities around them which have been the most stressed in the Bay Area. But it also plays a really important role in our thinking around the types of interventions that will have greatest long-lasting impacts. I think all of these interventions unlock tremendous value, tremendous economic value for the region, as well as for the communities around them. And I think the test of these strategies are going to be how can we capture that value and deploy it in a manner that it just doesn't think about flowing back to the infrastructure itself, but have long-lasting impacts in the community. So I think that's going to be a critical piece of our thinking as we think of developing these solutions so that these impacts stay in the community and the communities have the greatest benefit.
West Oakland and East Palo Alto are caught between two surges, rising sea level and rising housing prices. And community members legitimately fear that design solutions that help them become more resilient to climate change will exacerbate gentrification and squeeze them out. We recognize that listening is going to be even more important in this next phase of the challenge, to hear lift up the community concerns, their visions, and solutions. And we will bring all of the professional know-how, creativity, and resources we possibly can to the table. But we are committed to respecting the communities in place, human and ecological, and putting them at the center of our approach so that they can participate and benefit not as objects of promises about the future, but as subjects of their own destiny. And we look forward to working with you together as we do this. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll just give people just a minute. If anyone needs to leave the room, we're going to have one more presentation, and then we're going to have a little bit of a break. So if you can just hold on through one more presentation. We'll just, again, if you need to slip out, go ahead and slip out now. And then we will welcome up to the stage our Permaculture and Social Equity team.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Antonio Roman Alcalá. I'm here representing the Permaculture and Social Equity team. We're a team from around the country. We have Ross Martin, design from New York, Communitecture from Portland, Pandora Thomas from Berkeley, Base Landscape Architecture from San Francisco, the Urban Permaculture Institute also from San Francisco, Brown and Caldwell from the East Bay, and myself, I'm born and raised in San Francisco. So you can see we're largely rooted here in the Bay Area, and that might inform sort of our design approach, where we see communities, and especially vulnerable communities, not just as potential partners in designing for resilience, but actually as leaders in their own right. And this is something you will see throughout our design opportunities. Who has this is mine. So this is our first slide. Where do I point this thing? So this is why we think that resilient by design should be resilient by design by everybody. And our interest, of course, we've been told we should be thinking a lot about sea level rise and the impact on some of this larger urban infrastructure. And of course, we are concerned about these things, but we're really more interested in how do we connect what's going on at the community level to these issues. And we know, as we've talked about a lot, that there's sort of different kinds of issues that people are facing, both chronic stressors as well as these sort of acute shocks relating to some of this larger scale infrastructure. And we believe that it's really important to focus on those most vulnerable communities and what do they think about the problems, what do they define as the problems, and what do they define as the solutions. And by focusing on that, we can actually build a sort of collective capacity to deal with some of these larger issues. Similarly, we know that there's different scales at which solutions are rolled out. And so at the community scale, people are able to act very immediately, often doing interventions that cost a lot less or are easy to get going. And in the process of so doing, they often end up building capacity, building skills, and building a sort of value system and a culture of resilience, which we think is very required for that sort of 1,000-year long-term vision for creating a totally different kind of culture for resilience. At the same time, there are clearly limitations to what you can accomplish at the community level, and so it's important also to look at the public scale, which might include city governments, city agencies, regional agencies, and so on. There's a lot that needs to be done at that scale, but they tend to take longer. So our interest, of course, is how do we link and unite these two kinds of efforts more effectively. So stepping back a second, we are the Permaculture and Social Equity team, and we don't have time to go into what permaculture is, but you can see that some of the principles by which permaculture designers design are listed there, and a really pertinent and important one for this context is that permaculture focuses on what we call small and slow solutions. We feel that making very big moves, very top-down moves, can inadvertently have negative consequences on the communities and the ecologies we're supposed to be serving. And so we prefer to find those solutions which work at that small and slow level and actually amplify them, build them up. So this leads us back to our general theme, which is we don't want to see people just be engaged as communities. We want to see them lead the process of design. And these are some of the outcomes that happen from that. This isn't just some abstract, great idea in theory. This is something that we've lived as designers and as activists. So for myself, I helped found Alamany Farm here in San Francisco. Has anyone ever heard of it? A few people. So Alamany Farm was a guerrilla garden. We had no permission from the city government to do what we did initially. Now it is considered sort of a jewel of the urban agriculture scene here in San Francisco. We also partner with many other similarly volunteer-based, grassroots-based community farm projects in San Francisco to actually change the city government law around urban agriculture and to actually change state law to support urban agriculture. So those are things that happen at the community level and get absorbed. Similarly, Ross Martin from our team, after Hurricane Sandy, developed some bioswales in his community garden, and these were so successful that him and his partners are actually given $2 million by the federal government to expand these bioswales into other spaces across the city. So these are examples that show how social innovation at the community level can lead to a greater government role in designing for and engendering resilience. We think that there's a lot of synergies potential building upon what communities are already doing. At the same time, I want to recognize that government doesn't always have a positive role and in fact can stymie some of these innovations or can even be responsible for the unresilience in the first place. And I was just informed today that there's a meeting between the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing and the Midtown apartments, which were intended to be, it's 139 units that were intended to be owned by tenants through a co-op housing structure. And unfortunately, the city is now basically trying to displace the longtime residents through increasing their rent from 30% to up to 300% rent increases. And these are low-income, mostly Black and immigrant tenants. So there's examples where this is tension. It's not always automatic that governments partner with communities, but we are clearly very interested in seeing how we can partner together. So our first design opportunity is, how do we do this? How do we build upon what is already being done around the Bay Area? And it's called regional resilience from the ground up. There's some of the permaculture principles that the design inspires. And you'll see that, of course, we have this in our own personal backgrounds, this working at the community level, but we also saw it on our tours, and here are some of the places that we saw folks at the community level already building resilience themselves. So the plan is pretty much this. We want to work with communities to map and assess what already is happening at this community level, to understand both what people are doing, about what issues, what is succeeding, what is not succeeding, and importantly, what are the gaps? What do these folks who are doing this actually think is necessary to build up from their work? Importantly, for a lot of other resiliency stakeholders like governments or like RBD itself, we need to understand how to work with these communities. And so we want to have this process also develop a series of recommendations for these other stakeholders about how communities want to be worked with. What does that look like? And through this, we are also walking the talk, let's say. We heard a lot from communities about how they felt left out of the RBD process. Why aren't they on the design teams? So during this phase, we would hire what we're calling community resilience ambassadors, who would be leadership from all 9 of the counties to take part in co-designing and co-implementing this entire process of mapping and assessment. So this is about building capacity. At the same time, it's saying that we have something to learn from the communities while they're learning from us as designers. This is just an example of what it might look like afterwards. You'd assess and see all these different resilience infrastructure being put in by folks, as well as we would know all these details about their ethnic composition, their funding, et cetera. And importantly, like I mentioned, we would know what are the gaps, what are the things that they feel is needed to expand their success. And to do that, what we're going to do is follow up the design process with what we're calling the Summer of Resilience. And this would take place in the summer of 2018, where we'd partner with 5 to 10 of the organizations identified through the mapping process and co-construct these workshops where we would actually implement hands-on infrastructure, such as, you can see some rain barrels there, but we wouldn't just limit it to actually doing some small-scale infrastructure. We would want to have expanded eco-literacy, where folks are able to connect what they're doing to these larger issues so they can understand the rain barrels in relationship to the upstream infrastructure, as well as the vulnerability of, say, wastewater treatment plants at the bay's edge and sea level rise. And so there's many partners who'd be involved in that. And just ending on our timeline again, this is not something we expect to just end through the RBD process. We'd also like to embed this in an organizational home, and we have steps throughout the way to identify funding and different mechanisms to actually continue this process so it can form a sort of upward spiral where every year we have more and more people involved, and this map is being used both by the communities themselves as well as various stakeholders who are interested in how do we build out a culture of resilience and resiliency infrastructure throughout the Bay. I'll just pass it over to Patricia now.
Good afternoon, Patricia Algara with Bay's Landscape Architecture. And in addition to this larger framework, we're also looking at 2 site-specific ideas for this challenge. So I'm going to start by telling you the story of the language of water in San Francisco, particularly in Isaias Creek. This is a site that we selected because we feel a very strong connection to the site. A lot of us are from there, have connections to the community work, and so we decided to focus there. The potable water of San Francisco comes from Hetchy, and it crosses 4 major fault lines. It's not only a threat for that, but it's also a threat in fire. It's also a threat of drought. There's many issues with the water coming to San Francisco. San Francisco also gets almost 11 billion gallons of rainwater. That water could be captured and stored and reused, but instead, most of it goes down the drain, a drain that is a combined sewage system. So that means that it gets polluted, and the system cannot handle that amount of water. So usually that water backflows, goes up the drains and into the homes of San Francisco. The Southeast Treatment Plant is located at the base of the Isaias watershed. That neighborhood is a neighborhood that usually carries the brunt of these floodings. And this is how that looks like in the streets of San Francisco, in the homes. And usually the city of San Francisco has to pay for the damage of those homes. So we like to think about what this watershed used to be like. So Isaias Creek used to run year-round. It used to provide 85% of the water for the city of San Francisco. Salmon used to swim up that stream, and the whole area was covered with cherry trees. That's where the name Isaias comes from. But then it got culverted, so the freeway could go above it. The City of San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has been already doing a lot of work with the community, has had an incredible process to realize what are the potential solutions for this water problem, for the flooding. And a lot of ideas have come out of that. We would like to incorporate those ideas and work with what has already been done in the community. However, this work was only looking at flooding from rain of a 5-hour storm in a 3-year 5-hour storm. So we know that there are other issues that we need to look at. We need to look at drought, we need to look at sea level rise. And you can see right here that at the 6-foot flooding, the treatment facility is not going to be flooded, but it's right on the edge, and the outpour of water into the bay will be flooded. The treatment facility is not going to work when that seawater comes up. And at 16 foot, that whole area is going to be flooded. So our idea is one of decentralization of the stormwater treatment. We would like to work with the city of San Francisco to figure out slow and small solutions that can work upstream so that slowly we can start to reduce the amount of water that's going into that treatment facility, and we can divert it and treat it upstream in smaller ways. We would do this working with some of the local communities that we already have an established connection with. This is a list of some of the people that we have already been working with, that we already know, and that want to do alternative solutions. We would also like to do this as a collaborative process with all of the stakeholders. So working with the city and everyone else who is involved in this process. Right now, we find ourselves at this place where we have these hypothetical ideas of what could happen with the Resilience by Design Challenge. But the other step would be to identify funding mechanisms and identify all of the stakeholders within the area so that we can work into a leadership training. That way we can identify all of the different concepts. We can identify new designs and then implement those designs. Once they're implemented, we can look at all the lessons learned, what's working, what's not working, how can we implement it, and from that create a new paradigm. That new paradigm then would be a process that could be replicated and adopted by the city, and we can create new projects. So we have 3 scales of this. At the household scale, we're looking at a typical single-family home in San Francisco. The potable water that comes into a typical home, about 1/3 of that goes down the toilet. So our idea at this home scale is to have composting toilets, gray water reuse, and rainwater catchment. This will save about 75% of the water in a home scale. We also want to implement other stormwater solutions that will allow water to permeate and less water to go down the drain. This will mean that about 25% of the water will be diverted from the treatment facility. At the public scale, we want to look at schools, because at school level, we can also have a larger body of students. We would also look at composting toilets, because that makes we could save about 60% of the water. And we also want to look at a potential of having large infrastructure for cisterns underground where we can capture water and have that water available for emergency use. At the watershed scale, we want to look at daylighting the creek to make space for water, and looking especially at the Alamany Farmers Market, which we think this is a great place where we can provide a beautiful space, have access to nature, have access to that creek, have a much better, vibrant space for communities to gather. We would also propose to have a flooding area underneath the freeway. That way we allow the water to flood and we give it more space. We also can collect it underneath the farmer's market. And eventually we want to create space for the water to go and slowly transition the industry so that we can create space for wetlands in the area that's going to be flooded.
Hi, I'm Mark Lakeman with Communitecture. So we have a very social process-oriented team. Our third opportunity is located in the northern extent of the bay in the San Pablo Bay, actually. We're very fortunate to have a number of team members able to tour together from site to site almost the entire time. And so our site selection process was very immediate. And for us, of course, we were learning along the way about the different vulnerabilities and the different sort of states of the communities, their various planning efforts that were not underway, their concerns. We were heartened by how many people were becoming aware, and we were also inspired by the amount of initiatives that had already been kind of enacted as tests. So that was brilliant. At the same time, we were looking for communities that weren't just vulnerable, but ones that were capable of getting started. That's a key component for us, being such a socially process-oriented group. We arrived on Mare Island, and it was immediately inspiring to us, especially because it's a direct connection to Vallejo, which was one such community with apparent capacity. As we were touring the vast infrastructure and looking at it as an opportunity to match the needs of the region and the local city of Vallejo to the resource, which is frankly planned in many different documents that we've studied. At the same time, this was the day of the Las Vegas massacre, so we were deeply affected, and the cemetery kind of inspired some new thinking in us about possibilities for the region that might become urgent and imminent. So looking at the different conditions here, of course the island is almost inundated with the combination of fluvial events, sea level rise, and storm conditions. Definitely it merits protection because there's a deep commitment to that infrastructure to preserve it and also repurpose it. So we identified areas of possible strategic adaptation and then thought about resilience projects to enact in those locations. The relationship of Mare Island to Vallejo is very direct. They're part of the same city, and at the same time, as it's a very special relationship, also clearly the withdrawal of the naval base has had a tremendous impact upon the economy and the social culture of Vallejo to great detrimental effect. One neighborhood in particular here, immediately adjacent, is a very activated community in many respects, but also very distressed on almost every kind of social, environmental, economic indicator, health-related. Looking at the infrastructure around the perimeter especially, it's very much of an architectural problem of matching what we need to do with what resources we have. But also upland, there's wildlife and there's various different amenities. In fact, it's an archaeological Disneyland on this site. So we started to try to sort of cluster these pieces and see how they might exist in relation. Looking at them vertically across the landscape, starting with the water's edge, we began by repurposing the causeway into a regional aquatic transportation sort of access linkage point, and then up from there, repurposing a cluster of architectural remnants into an outdoor education facility, moving up from there, an extension of the existing cemetery to become a regional memorial, which we'll show you in a second, and then from there, repurposing underutilized open space, controversially including a golf course, to become a place of energy generation and food production, powering as many as almost 2,000 homes and producing tons and tons of food, locally sourced food. So looking at our design opportunities on this site, to the west, we have about 150,000 square feet of buildings that are really in quite great shape, and we're proposing this as an equity and livelihood-oriented village for refugee and vulnerable populations to be able to come, earn a living wage, live together with their families while, we're hoping, we're projecting that we would be building resilience technologies for decentralized systems and at the same time growing food for the larger region as an economic basis, and this is what that might look like, just beginning with the existing architecture and then creating systems that connect things together. And when we say equity, we mean a place for everyone to be able to have a voice and have a meaningful role. Up on the top of the island, a regional memorial center that brings people from the cemetery through a processional sort of contoured path with places along the way leading to an architecture of the sky, which really is about taking advantage of the views while we facilitate community gathering and many other sort of functions that we think are appropriate for a location like this. And then finally, there's a cluster of remnant architecture at the southeast edge, which has already been identified with great enthusiasm as being a potential arts village. We think that it could also be linked with ecology so that it has an educational basis, certainly about production, exhibition, retail. Ultimately, though, The whole idea is to create a spectacular reinvention of the island that serves the entire region, all of Vallejo, of course, to revitalize its economy, provide a lot of housing, living wage jobs while we attract people from around the world. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to take about a 20 to 25-minute break now, so people can stretch, check your email, go to the bathroom, and then we'll be back for the final set of presentations. So we'll see you soon.